I feel like a deer in headlights. Welcome to my channel. In case you don't know already, my name is Toch. So this is the second installment of my code reviews. So basically what I do here is I go through a bunch of different code libraries in the Node.js ecosystem and the JavaScript ecosystem, and I basically just leave a quick review for each one. And the star of today's video is a Node.js framework called NestJS. So without further ado, let's head over to their website and see what they have to say about themselves. So in their own words, NestJS is a progressive Node.js framework for building efficient, reliable, and scalable server-side applications. Let's also quickly take a look at some of the features that they're marketing on their webpage here. So extensible gives you true flexibility by allowing use of any other libraries thanks to modular architecture. Pretty sweet. Versatile, an adaptable ecosystem that is fully fledged. I can't read, Jesus Christ. An adaptable ecosystem that is a fully fledged backbone for all kinds of server-side applications. Progressive. It takes advantage of the latest JavaScript features, bringing design patterns and mature solutions to the Node.js world. Now that just sounds absolutely fantastic. So that's basically how they describe themselves. But now the question is, how would I describe them? So basically I would describe it as a level of abstraction, which sits on top of another Node.js server framework. And it gives you two options for which lower level Node.js framework to choose. And the ones that it comes with out of the box are Express and Fastify. And with that level of abstraction comes a bunch of best practice design patterns and features which are geared towards building large scale applications. So I've known about this framework for quite some time now, but I've never really been inclined to use it myself. Typically, whenever I want to build a server app, I just go straight for Express or something like that. Well, typically Express. So basically up until now, I've just really never had a reason to use it except for the purpose of making this video. And I'll get into why that is towards the end. So after pouring through the documentation for quite some time, I was able to build this sample application. So it's basically a hybrid between an MVC application and a JSON API. So basically some of the routes, or what that means is that some of the routes return HTML pages and some other routes return JSON data. And I chose to do it that way so that I could cover a wider range of the features and design patterns that this framework has to offer. So it's a very simple application. I built at least one route for each of the CRUD operations, create, read, update, and delete. But I also implemented a very, very rudimentary authentication system, as well as a user management / database system. It's certainly, and I can't say this with any more emphasis, certainly not something you want to do in a production application. The only reason I did this was just because I was basically focusing on the framework itself and not worrying about, a database system or authentication system. So in building the application, I wanted to make sure that I got a taste of its routing system, its middleware system, its controller system, as well as its error handling system. So before I get into the review, I just want to talk about some things that I liked and some things that I didn't like, starting with the ones I didn't like naturally. But first up is the guards. So they have this guard system, which is basically a way to protect your routes based on whatever custom logic you want to. But the weird thing is that in the guards, it doesn't let you redirect the user. Let's say, for example, you wanted to protect your profile page of the application from users who weren't authenticated. So basically, a user has to be logged in before they can get to their profile, right? So if the user, goes on the website and goes to /profile, right? You would imagine that a guard should be able to prevent the user from accessing the profile page, but also redirect them to the login page. But you can't really do that naturally in the framework. Technically you can, but then you get an unhandled rejection if you do it that way, which is certainly not a good thing. So what I ended up doing to implement that feature instead was I used a middleware and put all the logic for protecting the routes in there. So the second thing that I don't really care for is the way in which you apply middlewares to different routes of the application. So they have this really, really beautiful decorator pattern, which they use for applying guards, pipes, and a few other things. But for some reason, when it comes to applying middleware, they don't let you use, or I couldn't find a way, and I'm not sure that there is one, to use decorators to bind middlewares to the routes that they function on. But instead, what you have to do to bind your middlewares, at least according to what they show on their documentation, is that you go to the root app module, and then from there you can configure it you can add the middlewares and then you match up what routes they apply to, which again, they have this really great decorator pattern. I'm not sure why they didn't use that instead. So on to things that I liked about this framework. So like I said earlier, I really love the decorator pattern that they have for binding things like guards, pipes, and a few other things. And I also really enjoy their method for handling exceptions. I think they call them exception filters. And exception handling in any application is certainly a very tricky art to master. And they certainly do a lot in helping you make sure that you can, return very descriptive exceptions to the client. So now it's time for the review. And first off, we're going to start with the documentation. So the documentation gets a 5 out of 5. So they have a very detailed documentation. Lots of different examples on it. Lots of different graphics, which is a plus in helping understand things. I barely needed to, do Googling outside of, the website, like maybe on Stack Overflow to figure things out. Almost everything that I needed to know to build the sample application came directly from their documentation. So it's really well made. So next is the popularity. The popularity gets a 4 out of 5. So it has a very solid amount of stars on its GitHub page, about 33,000. And if I had to use the analogy to describe it, I'd say that makes it like a B-list celebrity. And also it has about 63 GitHub issues that are currently open. So it's really tricky to rank a package based on GitHub issues because for one, if a package has too few issues, then that's kind of a red flag because it could mean that, not a lot of people are using it. And, so there's not a lot of content. Like, let's say you experience an error, you may not have a lot of examples that can help you fix it. But at the same time, you also don't want a package to have way too many open issues because that could mean that, maybe the package isn't being well maintained anymore and stuff like that. But basically this one has 63, which is about a good amount. And if you look through some of the issues here, you can see that there's a fair amount of back and forth between the people in the open source community that are talking about this issue. So that's typically a good thing. So on NPM, it shows that the package gets about 197,000 weekly downloads, which is a very good thing. And when I do a topic search for NestJS on Stack Overflow, it comes up with over 7,000 different hits. And this is a really good thing. It means that there's a huge chance that anytime you encounter an error, you can find potential solutions or you can find people that are talking about the same error that you may be experiencing. So next up is the learning curve. The learning curve for this one gets a 2 out of 5. So there's a reason why its documentation is so detailed, and it's because there's just so much stuff that you need to understand to use this framework. And even before you even download the framework, there are some prerequisite knowledge that you need to have before you can start using it. For example, you need to understand the fundamentals of REST APIs, and you also need to know you need to know one of either Express or Fastify before jumping into this. And then once you understand your fundamentals, you then have to understand the different features that come with this framework, which include, the modules, pipes, guards, providers, interceptors, decorators, exception filters, and that's just to name a few. Well, actually to name most of them. And so this framework also reminds me a lot of Angular. I feel like it's inspired by a lot of Angular's features with the way it does its module system and, pipes and, the way it does its guard system, injectables and, all that kind of stuff, providers, etc., etc. I feel like it takes a lot of inspiration from Angular. And so if you know Angular, you do get like a leg up in terms of being able to come in here and understand, what this framework behaves like. So the setup gets a 4 out of 5. So very similar to Angular, there is a lot of boilerplate code that comes with just writing code in this framework, but it also has a very powerful CLI, command line interface, which lets you generate a lot of that boilerplate code. So you can, from the command line, generate, controllers, generate modules, generate guards, pipes, and a lot of other things. So even though there is a lot of boilerplate, it also provides you with this really powerful CLI that helps you generate most of that code. So next up is pricing. And to be honest, I'm not really sure if it's right to do pricing for open source libraries and tools because they're free. So there isn't really a point to do pricing. So maybe in future videos, I may just skip over pricing if the tool is completely open source. But the pricing gets a 5 for obvious reasons. It's absolutely free to use. So you can, use it as much or as little as you want, and you don't have to pay anything. So it's awesome in that regard. And so in the end, it gets a final score of a 4 out of 5. So it's overall, it's a really solid Node.js framework to use. It has a lot of useful features, and you know, it's pretty powerful too. So it's decent. So in closing, the key question for me is, would I ever choose to use this framework NestJS over, say, Express.js, which is one of the frameworks that, you know, NestJS is built upon? And the answer is no. Now, don't get me wrong, like I said, NestJS is pretty powerful, but it's really no more powerful than Express.js itself, right? There isn't really anything that you can do in NestJS that you can't do in Express. And even like with all the fancy design patterns that it has, you can easily, well, maybe not easily, but it's possible to design those patterns yourself in an Express app. I pretty much do it all the time in, you know, the Express code that I write for my work. So all those patterns, or the majority of those patterns, or even equally useful patterns, can be designed in a bare bones Express.js app. So for me, there is no reason to add this overhead or this restriction of doing things the way that NestJS wants to do it. I've been writing Express code for long enough that, you know, I can do things the way I know how to do it, and you know, it's for the most part, you know, just as good as what NestJS is giving you out of the box. So personally, I'd say that the biggest advantage that NestJS has over Express is mostly in the developer experience category. And so, for example, let's say you're working on a large team, or at least a decently enough sized team, maybe like 3 or 4 people. And, you know, each of those people might come from different backgrounds and might have different ways of doing things. And especially in Express.js, it's very unopinionated, which means that it allows you to do the same thing in multiple different ways. But NestJS, it only allows you to do the same thing in a few different ways. So what that basically means is that it enforces consistency in the way that you write your code, versus in Express, where, you know, you can see 2 different modules in the application that look completely differently because, you know, different developers wrote them. And that, my friends, brings us to the end of this video. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If so, be sure to leave a like, and if you want to see more stuff like this, hit that subscribe button. And yeah, I'll see you in the next video. Have a good one.